welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. I am Lucy Steigerwald. Here in the internet studio, I have a very cool guest, and that is Natasha Lennard. And welcome, Natasha. I'm very excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Lucy. It's nice to be here. And I'm looking at your studio behind you, and it looks like you've got lots of lovely plants and things. So nice to be virtually joining you.
All right, so I do have lovely plants, but let's talk about
Me.
Yes. Okay, so Natasha is a columnist for the Intercept. Her work has appeared in The Nation, Bookforum, and Dissent, among others. She's the associate director of the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism program at the New School, which is intriguing. I know a little bit about the New School, but not that much. She's the author of Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life from Verso Books, and she's working on her next book on how we might better conceptualize uncertainty and certainty, also for Verso. And on a side note, I think I've been seeing your name since Occupy Wall Street days, is probably when I first started seeing your byline. So you've been around a little while, I guess.
I suppose I've been doing writing around, like dissent and protest and like anti-fascist activities since I suppose 15 years. I don't know, feeling old. But yeah.
Well, I like to start with you on a personal political level. Can you tell me how, if I accosted you and asked you to describe your current politics, like what would you say?
It's a very difficult one to sum up because I don't think there's like one singular tendency that like I can easily be like, I'm an anarchist, because I would say I'm probably an anti-state or a state-cautious communist with an anarcho lens. So it sounds like I'm describing like a weird wine with different like hints or flavors. I'm more interested in the different kind of anti-authoritarian processes that we can engage in collectively across sort of legacy left tendencies. So some of my best friends are socialists, and I'm also involved with a bunch of anarchist mutual aid networks, but also, don't reject the possibility of having to negotiate with some way with at least local state politics, even though I would like it all to be dramatically undone and have a profound hatred of border logics and things like that. So I would say it's those set of tendencies come together without necessarily forming a perfect political identity. But so with all that rambling,
I do love state cautious. I've actually never heard that, and that's so much more fun than minarchist, which is what I'm used to. Sort of, state cautious.
I literally just made it up as I was talking. So I was like, what is it?
Right.
I'm state, I'm like anti-state, but it's not like I pretend it doesn't exist.
I like it. Did you have any kind of journey, from then to now? Did you change at all?
I think I probably, in certain ways, have made various journeys actually. So I wasn't a particularly like politicized or radicalized teenager. I grew up in London and was really, I was academically interested in leftist thought, but really I was kind of a party girl, and really only got involved in political action and more radical thought in a more kind of like praxis based way once I was like 22 in graduate school, when I moved to New York and fell in happily with a bunch of anarchists and squatters and people thinking very seriously about like prefigurative politics. And these were some of the groups that indeed were meeting in the lead up to Occupy, with David Graeber around, and were paying a lot of attention to the square movements in Spain and in Greece. And I was making friends through, efforts to open up squat spaces in the wake of the 2008-9 financial housing crisis, because we had slightly misthought it. We had, like, there was this vision that perhaps this was, the 90s again in New York, and these were empty spaces. But they were not. This was not white flight. This was warehousing. So it was actually very difficult to liberate any of these, stalled apartment buildings, empty spaces. But I met a lot of fascinating, brilliant people then, including people from the kind of, 80s, 90s squat movements, like Father Frank Morales in the Lower East Side, who's like a radical theologian who was very much part of the, wave of successful squat movements in New York 30 years ago. So that was a real education for me, and certainly was the first time I'd done a kind of like full forms of life sort of radical politics, but very much then was only um, had very little interest in anything like a conversation about the uses of something like the Democratic Socialists as an umbrella organization. We were that corner of Occupy that were only there for the disruption, but also the prefigurative living, but very much not interested in talking about whether demands could be useful or not. And I'm a little bit more sanguine about some of that stuff now. I think I have a more kind of capacious space for strategies, and that certainly doesn't mean, I don't think it's a move away from a belief in the importance of militancy, like that has remained since that time, but actually rather more a desire to be even more capacious in the concept of diversity of tactics and strategy. And that means not foreclosing conversations around like building mass politics and building working around questions of union building, and even the open question about the uses of something like the DSA, which, if you'd asked me at 22, I would have been like, hell no, like, smash all, carrying like a broken copy of like Deleuze and Guattari around, very pretentious. So I hope I'm less pretentious.
Um, did Occupy specifically change you as well?
Yeah, I would say it did. And the kind of luck I had, and I think it changed a lot of people that of related but differing leftist and anti-authoritarian tendencies who I remain friends with to this day, from some of the more kind of frontline organizers who were part of the general assemblies there, to reporters who were first kind of understanding what it was to create kind of counter narratives in media when you had the New York Times looking at the movement like it was some sort of weird, quirky joke. And at the time, I had been stringing, kind of day rate freelancer at the New York Times, um, whilst also organizing. So they, didn't love that in the end. But it was one of those times I started seeing that difference of the way, movement politics was so readily dismissed by an establishment mainstream media, and the sets of narratives that got established in those sort of spaces, and then making friends in alternative media spaces, and people working for Democracy Now! At the time, who remain friends to this day, and then like organizers and participants. And I think I was 22 at the time, maybe 23, and it was extremely exciting, and it was this like heady moment of thinking like, wow, maybe everything could change through this, which was and in many ways it did. I do think it was a kind of shift moment for the left, without which we couldn't speak about the kind of formations and thinking the left in the US has now, and I would say for better. um but I also think there was a headiness to it that was misplaced. Like, for example, I can look back and cringe about the fact that we called, without any extended organizing around this, without understanding what this really could mean, without understanding what kind of union contracts look like, or how many years these kind of things take to plan, we called for a general strike
Oh, sure,
willy-nilly.
yeah.
Yeah, we were like, general strike, May Day 2012, and was somehow sort of shocked that there wasn't a general strike, because we'd made really cool like videos propagandizing it.
Mm.
So I think I can look back on some of that folly, and cringe. I can also look back at the really like profoundly flawed lack of racial capitalist analysis, that we had an
Mm.
analysis of capitalism that was lacking because it wasn't an analysis of the capitalism in which we live, which is racial capitalism. So didn't reckon, with 500 years of global racial empire, but was still, I think, a huge, yeah, like a kind of rupture in what felt possible in terms of political movements spreading at speed with huge scope. Um, Realizing that importance, which I still advocate, of a politics that is a form of life, that is lived. So I think for myself, it's not like I was camping out at Zuccotti Park. Like I don't like camping, but I was spending all like so much time there, and then also in various meetings around it, and it was sort of this kind of organizing force of daily life, and that was amazing. And it does make me think of people who are just that micro generation younger, or maybe joined politics of the left a little later, who talk about their politicizing moment being like the Bernie campaign
Hmm.
in 2016. And God bless whatever version of realizing that we have to be in collective action together, whatever the trigger is, whatever the catalyst
Hmm.
is, I'm pro it. But it's obviously a very different experience to be kind of door knocking for a candidate and going to meetings rather than like, how do we organize our days? How do we strategize this next thing? Like, what are we going to do with like literally ourselves every day? And to not have those clear parameters of a goal, except for, reordering what society looks like and trying to think that through together. And in the same way, it's been really amazing to see, because, having students now and things like that, um, having seen students engage and participate in the encampments movement for Palestine, the Gaza
Hmm.
solidarity encampments, who are also doing this kind of lived and obviously like those have been brutally repressed across the country, and police raids abundant. But people live it like figuring out taking space together, and it being about kind of circulation of bodies and use of time, and not just a kind of task-based politics. And so I felt very lucky that my politicizing moment was one of those kind of lived in political moments, and I think we should have those in the same way, Standing Rock, Stop Cop City in
Hmm.
Atlanta, these are all site-based, even if only temporarily.
Oh man, there's a million different avenues that I'm tempted to take you down there. I eh, you basically are a journalist, an academic, and an activist. Am I wrong? Do you feel like you're all those things?
I think I'm those things sort of cobbled together, because it's really hard to just have one job these days, because
Hmm.
in this economy.
Hmm.
But also I want to hear about I want to hear about your um sort of journey as well, and whether ours map.
I don't even know what my journey is. I feel like I haven't even started yet in some ways, but I was in DC when Occupy was happening, and I went to a single Occupy DC meeting, and I liked almost everybody I talked to, and I remember thinking this like I love this consensus thing, but my god, it takes a long time to have consensus on everything. Um so yeah, like as much as I'm not into electoral politics, comparing say like the Bernie thing to what almost sounds like trying to remake the whole world a little bit. Um Trying to get a candidate elected suddenly sounds easy compared to that. So I can see how that would be freer, but also that seems more daunting to me. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and also to be clear, some and again, like all power to them, but people who are truly truly committed to an absolutism around horizontalism, right? As in everything must be totally consensus based in this political. I mean, I don't think that could work for a lot of lived political organizing spaces or movements, and I hate long meetings, and I really, I was not one of the like um diehard meeting attendees. I
Mm.
like the kind of movements where you can plug in different ways and find what, like to each his ability, to for each their need. figuring out like where to best. I like the movements that have like multifaceted plug-in spots, so that it's not like everyone has to sit in a meeting forever. Because
Yeah,
yeah, also not
that's
my thing.
that's how people in life works a lot better. So you're
Mm-hmm.
not. It's not as smooth a transition, but our one editor heard you talking about general strikes on, I believe, Intercept podcast recently, which I didn't get to that one, but he's dying for me to ask you about general strikes, and your thoughts on the whole 2028 talk about having one.
Well, I will certainly say it is a more reasonable timeline than the pretend general strike that we called within a matter of months and or weeks for May
Mm,
Day 2012. I think a 4 year. Look. I am not a. I've not done years and years of uh, elaborate and intricate labor organizing. I'm not a
mhm,
union leader. I'm a member of the Freelance Solidarity Union of the National Writers Union, Freelance Solidarity Project. The full time faculty at my university don't have a union. We're trying to build one. I used to be in the part time faculty union. I'm not a deeply experienced union organizer. I do think we're at an extraordinary moment of um, given 75 plus years of labor organizing being profoundly on the back foot and curtailed and stifled, by the long arm of the Taft-Hartley Act and other kinds of anti-labor laws nationwide. I think we've seen, given that context, an amazing resurgence of labor activity and union power, and particularly around things like teachers' unions, nurses' unions, service worker unions, Amazon unions, the kind of unions that actually are realistic representatives of the multiracial majority women working class that we have in this country, that is not whatever Bidenomics and frameworks, Democrat Party and Trumpian frameworks of the American working class, white man, blue collar, hard hat. Actually, the unions, we're seeing extremely powerful union building across sectors, and in ways that are representative of the working class today. Of course, does that mean that there is the possibility of building towards a general strike in 4 years? I don't know. I think it's a good idea. I think it does. It does take probably at least that long, given that we're not France. We don't have whole sectoral unions. You can't be like all nurses, all. So to have all the different union shops in all the different states with all the different laws, I'm sure it's more difficult than I'm even imagining. Um, but I think even having the idea that a general strike is something to work towards be alive in our notion of labor politics today. I mean, that wasn't really true. Like when we did it, called a general strike not for Occupy, that was sort of laughable. Showed a kind of either a kind of sense of humor or a complete lack of understanding, but it wasn't serious, and it couldn't have been, and we didn't have the buy-in of labor. Whereas I think people are seeing a serious rise in labor organizing, and when you've got leaders like Sean Fain who are of the left, these are the kind of, if we're gonna have leaders at all, the kind of leaders I do want to be seeing and want to be in conversation with, and would much prefer to be the kind of people in any sort of representative positions. I think it's definitely, I don't know how exactly it is done, but I think it is exciting potentially that this is the sort of thing that is on at least the imaginary table. And this is a really shite time, and we don't know what sort of guardrails there are for even the kind of minimal and scarce protections and freedoms that people do have, and particularly black, brown, immigrant, trans, gender non-conforming people. But one site of power and protection is unnecessarily labor, because we know we can't rely on like the Democrats. So I think the idea of a people wanting to be involved in, start unions, join unions, connect, have unions be in conversation with each other, for the idea that there would be a generalized site of refusal, would be very exciting. I am pro it, but who knows what 4 years will look like? I just like, who knows?
It does sound like I mean, thinking about it, I understand why it might take that long in America, but it sounds. I can't even picture that year at this point. You
Right,
know.
right, right. So it's, yeah, but I think it's, if even the kind of, like throwing a dart into the future, and it's like, what if general strike 2028, if that means, what would we need to do, what would unions or organizers or different collectives need to do to make that seem realistic? Obviously it means some sort of broader connecting and being in conversation with, rather than it just being like each labor shop, each union shop fighting for its own specific demands against its own specific capitalist antagonist. Like, it does, yeah, it does at least seem to take seriously the need to be in like broader conversations as a expansive labor movement, rather than just isolated unions. But yeah, I guess we shall see.
Besides maybe the more obvious technology stuff, the kind of can you talk about how journalism has changed while you've been in it, which seems very dramatic.
Yeah, it's definitely bad. It's bad. There are none of jobs.
I know.
It's I mean, I guess there's two questions. Like the job of the being a
Hmm.
journalist as a job has become, unless you are right wing, has become extremely difficult to, especially if you're going to do that as like your one full-time job. It's the number of places that have shuttered, been bought by venture capitalists, completely
Hmm.
changed, then shuttered again. I mean, the example of Gawker is such a classic one, all the kind of different iterations and sales and lawsuits and collapses. And, we're talking tens of thousands of jobs over the last years just erased and erased and erased. And both because there just quite simply is not a business model
Hmm.
um, that can function well, and because of appalling management and poor
Hmm.
priorities on behalf of the ownership frameworks that we do have. I think it's worth keeping in mind there's actually never been a business model of news. There's been business models of advertising
Hmm.
and politics. No one's ever really. This is sort of the first era where we've been asking to people to just directly buy news, and that's where the kind of capital comes from.
Yeah, that's
Obviously
true.
there are
I
still,
guess.
yeah, it's like
Hmm.
there are advertising models, sure, but like not like there used to be. It's like there used to be an advertising industry on which newspapers could run,
Hmm.
um with subscriptions paying part of it, but those only worked by advertisers placing ads in the newspapers knowing that they would reach the subscribers. And now we just have this, hermetically sealed notion of like clips and attention and, presence on feeds that don't
Hmm.
actually really align with a business model particularly successfully. So, you've got the New York Times, which has a huge subscription base. It's one of the only like success stories in the last decades. But it also is like a games website and a cooking website. Like
Yeah,
that's where a
that's true.
huge
Hmm.
amount of its income comes from. On the right, there is a functioning business model, and it's called billionaires. And Peter Thiel will write a blank check um, for hegemony, right? And like liberal billionaires, um, they will put, the Soros Foundations, Pierre Omidyar, who used to fund First Look Media when the Intercept, where I have a column, was first founded. I mean, they have given over the years like significant monies, but it's usually like, here's a pot of money, make it profitable. And it's like,
Hmm.
oh, we're so sorry, this isn't profitable. If you want this to keep running, you have to keep writing checks. And
Hmm.
hilariously enough, like the right, like far right billionaires understand that. Like that's why Barry Weiss can like roll in money at the free press. But if you're on the left, um, even if you're on the kind of the liberal left, like, it's extremely difficult. And jobs are being kind of massacred here, left, right, and center. And if you're on the far left, it's always been difficult. Like that's never been a particularly easy place to make a living. But in terms of content and what's out there and the kind of different types of leftist thought and leftist public intellectual spaces that have been built through publications, I actually think it's a really exciting time because you've got kind of little magazines like Lux, which is a Marxist feminist magazine, Power Praxis, which is a magazine of psychoanalytic thought from and of the left. You've got Hammer and Hope, a magazine of anti-capitalist black radical tradition thinking taken into this current moment. You still have old kind of legacy things like Democracy Now. You've got podcasts like yours, and then podcasts like Ordinary Unhappiness and The Dig and Know Your Enemy. There's actually kind of a wealth of interesting and like very kind of like and deep thinking spaces that people are creating and able to kind of collectively raise money for. Obviously, it's not really kind of paying the rent for very many people at all. But I think in terms of like knowledge production and kind of the creation of a public and sets of publics through these kind of publishing activities, I'm actually quite excited about it and hopeful about it. It's just hard to know how to pay for it.
It surely is. But I mean, yeah, I haven't been thinking lately, like, why was PBS made? Why was Edward R. Murrow mad about stuff? Like, you're right, there was never a model for actual news and actually it being paid for by anything. Yeah. So we thought the rug was pulled out from under us, but maybe there was no rug.
There was no rug. I mean, obviously, it would be like there are places that have like proper state funding for these kind of things, for the arts, for culture, for which we're not going to see here anytime soon. But I would say, and NPR might lose even more funding under the next regime. So not a good time to be a working journalist, but a good time to be in conversation with people thinking seriously about the left, I think.
Well, that's something at least.
Yeah.
I guess potentially even more depressing. Let me set the scene with a radical cousin who is not happy about Trump, obviously, but he tends to look at things like the mainstream, the whatever you call the mainstream corporate middling media. They paid a hell of a lot more attention to immigration horrors, the most obvious example, under Trump. And, we all took a little breather there under Biden, and things like that. And I don't know. I just don't know how if you feel about like if things getting worse, being pressed a little more.
Yeah, I'm not an accelerationist in any
Mhm.
way. I think it's a very dangerous way of thinking because, or it's just um it's a kind of very it's a brutal calculus because it's a
Yeah.
willingness to sacrifice people that aren't yourself, really. Often it's like, well, it
Hmm.
has to get worse before it gets better. It's like, for whom? Like, like who gets like left to die in this
Hmm.
accelerationist, and like more, and you're sort of admitting more people, and I'm not willing to make that kind of to indulge in that kind of risk calculus as a potential good, because also I think it's unempirical. So like, yes, we did see a kind of liberal outrage machine after Trump 1.0, and the Women's March, and and like a rage about family separations, and that we didn't see under Biden when he shuttered the border to asylum seekers in the last year, and went, in many ways as far as Trump did, and in the legacy, of course, of Obama, rightly dubbed the deporter in chief,
Hmm.
Clinton, who militarized the southern border after signing the NAFTA free trade agreement. So this is obviously like reckoning with the convergence of liberal capitalist center politics with the far right around things like border logics takes
Hmm.
a much deeper reckoning than whether it's Biden or Trump. Like, this has been a problem in US politics for 40, 50 years, like, before Clinton, but really like doubled down with Clinton, and then obviously the Bush years. So just saying like, oh, it got, there was a hashtag resistance under Trump, so maybe that's good if we get that again. And it's like
Hmm.
that's also fate. That's a too short-sighted history as well,
Hmm.
because obviously that doesn't get us to a deeper challenge to the border logics that have actually just undergirded all US presidencies in any of our lifetimes, really. Um, so it just, to then, and so say that does happen, right? Say that
Hmm.
you get Democrats suddenly jumping to order and pretending that to care about the border, as opposed to what the campaign they ran on, which was a Republican. They
Truly
ran as
awful.
Republicans. They just,
Hmm.
yeah, they ran as
To the right of
Republicans.
George W. Bush.
Exactly. It was horrifying,
Hmm.
horrifying, horrifying shit. Um, so I mean, yeah, but if they, of course, we wouldn't be surprising to see them, completely shift and say the opposite once Trump is in power.
Hmm.
To what end, right? Like maybe it clearly wouldn't undo the kind of deeply entrenched anti-immigrant policies and laws that we've seen in place. That's always had to come from the ground up to really chat. Like we're not going to get that kind of response from the liberal center that's going to be in any lasting way a challenge to the kind of things that have fed into a Trump, the kind of things that have fed into it being the status quo, that you can just assume immigrants bad is taken as the status quo across the political mainstream. So yeah, I just think to presume that there might be some boon there, some benefit, um, I think is unempirical, but it's just too high a risk given that, like, we just know that things are already really bad and promise to get worse. And the idea that that's some sort of interregnum wherein things therefore necessarily get better. I'm not sure that, like, where is that coming from? Like, what's that based on?
I mean, I suppose in the short term attention on something awful could perhaps lead to, an individual protection of certain people within the horrible large scale thing. But yeah, I
I
mean,
think we would need a very different sort of political opposition party, which is why
mm-hmm,
we're in this place in the first place. Because if we had a proper, like, if there was a left party of any sorts, or if the Democrats were even Democrats,
mm-hmm,
we probably wouldn't end up with like Trump 2.0 in the first place. So there's a lot of counterfactuals in play that but I definitely like any sort of accelerationism that it's like, well, we've got to hit rock bottom, or like surely the contradictions of like fascist capitalism will come into, it's like, no, that's this weird telos of history. It's like, unless you're like a really weird Hegelian, like I'm not I'm just not seeing it happening. And so I think it's just more important to be like, okay, where can be pushed. And I think maybe, yeah,
mm-hmm.
like using, do I think the left needs to use some of that rhetoric against, democratic governors, democratic mayors? Sure, like let's like use whatever you can. Like if you need to double down on promises from New York City that it would be an asylum city, a sanctuary city, fine, sure, push on that, say, but like obviously that's also somewhat unrealistic that we have Mayor Adams as a mayor. Like we've got to get
Yeah,
rid of Mayor Adams.
yeah.
He's like our own kind of Trump,
Mm-hmm.
and like with all the absurdism involved. So yeah, I don't know. I have no room for gotta get worse before better, or nor do I have any hope that Democrats in opposition will make them work for us. Like, no,
Mm-hmm.
we still will have to make them work.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we're going to get any sort of like firewalls from in kind of blue parts of the country, we have to keep in mind who are the Democratic mayors, who are the Democratic governors. Like Gavin Newsom, Hochul. Like, I'm not feeling great about it, but like, so obviously those are sites for antagonism and pushing from below rather than, oh no, what, like surely they'll be so freaked out about Trump that they'll kind of help people. I'm not sure.
Well, I guess you were reminding me also of the fact, or rather, my supposition that to me there's more sort of mainstream, even critical coverage of Israel since the Gaza massacring started, but the situation there is so dire that if there was some sort of empirical trade-off, I mean, what would it, So yeah, like the idea that only the attention or even the critical op-eds about it will somehow be worth the atrocities is clearly not accurate.
Right,
So.
and that's the thing, and it's this idea of like, surely, how bad can it get? Like, what can they put up with? It's like we've literally just lived through a year of like a, a, a genocide wherein lack of knowledge and lack of proof and lack of visual evidence and constant flow of proof and evidence is lack thereof is hardly the problem. It is a live stream genocide. So this idea of, but surely it, once it gets so bad, it's like, no, I think Gaza is in many ways, as Palestine has long been, the kind of site of where politics shows its true face, where like a status quo of politics shows its true face, like where the limit of the Democratic Party machine's co-optive tendencies and practices. You'll get Nancy Pelosi kneeling in a kente cloth in 2020 during the Black Liberation uprisings, like whatever bullshit that was. They will not even let a vetted Palestinian American speaker on the floor at the DNC. Palestine has long been where like the rubber hits the road. And I think you're seeing it again in the most appalling ways. And so, yeah, I think when people were like, oh, what do we, like, because I've been asked this a bunch in the last 10 days about like the role of the anti-Harris kind of Gaza-based refusal to vote, or even
Mhm.
in some cases vote for Donald Trump, although we don't have enough granular information about how voting really played out in that way.
Mhm.
But we can say, like, it was not. We can say it was not votes for Gaza that tipped it for Trump.
Mhm.
And we cannot, and we can also say with confidence that it was not, abstentions against Harris that also won it for Trump around Gaza. But what I think we can also understand is, if we want to kind of, when people talk about single issues, which we shouldn't, if you think about it as a constellation, of course, like a broader distrust in Democrats and Democrats going forward, even under a Trump, is no doubt fostered by the kind of support and advocacy that the Biden administration, then Harris after, the kind of unabashed, disgusting, vile complicity and direct prosecution of a genocide. To think that doesn't affect how a party is understood, even if it's not a direct vote for or against around Gaza, and even people that did tick for Harris in swing states or in non-swing states. Um, I think going forward, thinking like, what would a anti-Trump, a liberal anti-fascism? It doesn't. It feels a lot less. It feels like it has like weaker legs to stand on than in 2016, when people are like, we are the anti-fascists. It's like, you've just been doing genocide. You
Yeah.
support genocide. So it's like, I think that kind of, which also kind of speaks to a weakness in a somewhat accelerationists, at least Democrats, when they're in opposition, will XYZ. It's like, oh no, I think establishment Democrats, anyone who has stood by this genocide, or refused to fight against, use their position to speak out against this genocide, has lost all standing to claim any sort of anti-fascist politic in the Trump years going forward. And I'm not sure they'll even try. Who knows?
Yeah. What about you mentioned Sanders before, and I've always had a soft spot for him as my sort
Mm.
of my favorite sellout, because to be in Congress for 30 years you have to be a sellout, but the odds that somebody in his, spot would be any better than him are slim. And so he's, if you're grading on a curve, an enormous curve, Sanders of late has been like, oh, geez, there's a genocide. Maybe I should. I mean, I don't know if that's worth anything, even a positive sort of reinforcement of that, or if we need to throw the whole thing out.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we, in various ways, need to at least replace the whole thing and do many other things. We can't keep relying on the thing,
Mhm.
the Congress thing. But no, nor do I think abolition of any sort of structures happens in a day. Like you have to kind of replace, build, experiment, try. And so, given that that's the case, yeah, like more Bernies, more squad types, obviously preferable. But and as we've seen in the last year, even that like the small inroads into having a left wing flank of the Democrats, APAC has done a very very good job at chipping away at that
Hmm.
and getting the like anti-Israel or at least Israel critical left flank either kicked out of their seats or at least under challenged resource wise because they've had to fight these very difficult races uh, against APAC funded
Hmm.
candidates. Someone like Bernie, I mean, he took far too long to speak out against the
He did.
genocide, far, far too long, and unacceptably too young. It is obviously it's generational. He's of a very specific, and I don't forgive him. Just like I'm Jewish, like it
Hmm.
didn't take me. It took me no time. But obviously, unlearning Zionism from his position is it's a different position and I
Hmm.
think we have to be real about that. I don't think that forecloses it. Obviously there are people of his exact demographic who have never been Zionists. There were labor bundists who were never Zionists. Like it's the long history of anti-Zionist Jewishness. Far Judaism and Jewishness far predates the state of Israel.
Hmm.
But I would say yes, where he's standing now, trying to pass a bill to stop this unconditional flow of weapons to Israel in the Senate. Obviously, a good thing. Unlikely to pass. Someone like Rashida Tlaib, I think, is even though again I'm with you, I'm not like I'm not looking for heroes in congressional representatives. But I actually think what she puts up with and continues to speak out as a Palestinian for her people, for Palestine, while being literally told by the people she has to go into work with every single day that she is a terrorist.
Hmm.
It's appalling what this woman
Hmm.
has to go through, and I think she is a force for good. So I think we can look to a Bernie because obviously he's the kind of old guard in those extremely old guard. But I actually think someone like Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, if we're saying if there's any kind of hope for what kind of a future of Democratic Party, if we are going to keep that sort of form alive and it doesn't look like it's going to go away overnight, it would obviously be like replacing the old guard with people like that, which is the opposite of what a sort of New York Times commentariat thinks should happen. They're
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
yes, because don't you know Donald Trump won because of woke.
Of course.
That's what happened.
I guess I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of reconfiguring that I don't know happened circa 2015 that I still almost feel like I'm trying to catch up with, where you will have people who vote for Sanders and then the next time vote for Trump, and this sort of the people who aren't quite as proudly proud boy or whatever the hell, but people who say, "Oh, I'm rejecting the Hillary Clinton-esque status quo Washington, and
Yeah.
somehow here I am at Trump." I mean, I find myself struggling. All I have for those people is it can always get worse, and sort of admitting your awful plans is at best exactly the same as not admitting your awful plans. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have very bad broader political education in this country, right?
Mm,
And I think people are overworked and have not enough time to really engage, and we don't have a kind of set of practices around political engagement that are anything but like sloganeering and
mhm.
ads on network TV and siloed news networks. So it's very very difficult to kind of be like to say to someone like, don't you understand, like a Bernie and a Trump, that's not the same. And of course we, yes, Hillary Clinton Democrats, Clintonite triangulation, all disgusting, fuck corporate America. But I think in the same way we saw um I think like a kind of very similar thing happened in the UK around Brexit.
Okay, yeah.
So obviously, I was really annoyed when Brexit went through because it's horrible, right? Like
Mhm.
it's not like I love Fortress Europe. It's not like, ooh, I heart the EU and like it's disgusting collective anti-migrant politics, and it's kind of creep to the right, but obviously better than just some cold grey British nationalist island. But I think there was this sort of liberal disgust when the Brexit vote won, because I was like, wow, is 51% of the country just this racist? And like, of course, there was a lot of nativism and racism and anti-migrant sentiment fostered in the Brexit campaign, for which the media and right-wing politicians, as in this country, and centrist politicians had a lot to answer for. Everyone, it's just a complete the way in which across the media sphere and the political sphere, these politicians are so willing to abscond from their responsibility in narrative formation and just say, "Oh, it's what voters want." It's like, no, no, no. You have the mic. You can
Mm-hmm.
help form these narratives. The UK, Europe, the US, some of the most powerful economies on earth can well manage millions more people, and will indeed have to. Um, Lebanon's population has, you know, added by a quarter in the last 10 years because of migration. Like, that's a country that can stand to handle that. We absolutely can. There are 360 million people in the United States of America,
And so much
and so
geography.
much space and
I
so much
mean, my
money.
God. Mm-hmm.
It's just, you can't do it at the same time as austerity. So what happened during Brexit is a little like what happens with certain swathes of Trump voters, is that yes, there was a kind of a nativist drive, but there
Mm-hmm.
were also buses being driven around saying 360 million extra pound sterling coming to the National Health Service every week if we leave Europe. These were these buses driven around by the pro-Brexit parties. And they were lies. They
Mm-hmm.
were lies based on, technically, that's what the UK paid to the EU. Britain paid to the EU, but like, obviously that was not direct money that was then going to kind of go back into the British economy, harmed as it has been by Brexit, and was going to be into the healthcare service. And in the same way, if Trump is walking around saying, "I am getting good jobs back to the US, and I will bring manufacturing back to your home," and by virtue of accident, prices were lower during the 4 years he was president, and he says that was me, and by virtue of appalling politics, all the COVID provisions were taken away by the Democrats during Biden's tenure. They could have kept them in place, to be clear. um, it's not necessarily wow, our country is a hate country. If you don't know a huge amount, and you are told that the economy is going to improve, and that you've been failed by this establishment, I don't think it's a sign of just like vile tribalist racism that people would make that choice, or that people would go from a Bernie to a Trump. Obviously, when that narrative is also involved with, and it's the immigrants' fault, and people start believing that, um, that's a narrative that needs to be shut down, demystified, and fought at every turn. But I don't, when people are like, this is just, the country wants fascism, it's like, a lot of people were lied to. A lot of people are being lied to about what can be done for them under a Trump regime.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, that
Oliver.
was very ranty.
No, no. I live in Pennsylvania, so I had a truly excessive amount of campaign-ness directed at me. And there are many horrible signs, and one of them says, "Oh my God, what does it say? Trump security, Harris open borders." And when that level of nonsense is so profound, I almost, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm in awe.
But
But these people who aren't paying attention, I mean, the people who made this sign are the ones lying. I guess I should
yeah,
focus more on them.
and it's also exactly who made the signs, but also at the same time, here's where I blame the liberal center and the
Hmm.
media who are of that terrain. Why are open borders a bad thing? Right?
Also,
It's
that.
like, that's the thing. It's completely untrue. Like, they
Hmm.
are, the Biden Democrats, like Clinton Democrats, like Obama Democrats, are closed border politicians and policymakers. Um, but the problem is that, like, all the um, frameworks that were like, it was just taken from the jump as immigrants being a bad thing, or there being a border crisis. the notion of the border is certainly not in crisis. If what do we think a crisis is, like something reaching it, like the promise you the border's not going anywhere, if only.
Alas.
Um, and when people talk about a migrant crisis, it's like, no, there's a crisis for the people are facing critical choices to leave their homes in extremis and find a kind of potentially what they believe will be a better future in this country. Um, and that could well be true if we understood it as a question of management rather than crisis, which it
Mhm.
absolutely could and should be. But we would need very, very different politics. We need to move away from this austerity scarcity politics. So, not it's like this kind of lie upon lie. A, that porous borders are a bad thing. B, that we have anything like them. But then you end up just falling into only like arguing in the second bit, being like, no, they
Mhm.
didn't open borders. It's like, well, what if they did? And actually, can someone take some responsibility, i.e., people in control of narrative formation, politicians and media commentators and reporters? If you just read reporting about migration in this country, in the US, you would imagine the entire weight of global migration was falling on the US's shoulders. A tiny fragment of it is. Most migration is obviously internal to countries within the global south or to countries, to neighboring countries. There is a tiny, tiny amount of migration that makes it to the west from people of the global south, makes it to the global north, in comparison. And so the idea that the most powerful economies in the world can't well handle it is, it's disgraceful, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, apparently the answer to slight growing pains and lack of resources in Springfield, because there's so many more immigrants, is to start fomenting like a racist pogrom against legal immigrants, as opposed to saying, "Could we have some more resources, please?"
Right. It's like it's like obviously if you want to double down on austerity, segmenting the working class by being like, no, it's the new ones, it's the brown ones, it's the black ones. That's the problem. If it like it's a very good tool to segment the working class, but obviously it's deeply unnecessary. But yeah, bad. Ugh.
Well, here's a overly big one. What should everyone from you to random disappointed that Trump was elected person be doing right now to prepare for
Ah,
whatever the hell's going to happen?
everyone should be. I did having conversations like this. I think is good, like with
Mhm.
people that you don't necessarily know. Obviously, like we have connections and things, so it's like the people you really wouldn't have connections with is um first talking to your neighbors, as they say. But no, I actually think there are, I think, looking to spaces that you're already able to engage with somewhat. So like if you live in an apartment and you have issues with your landlord, we've seen extraordinary rises in tenant organizing, and that can be like an incredible baseline of community protections, especially if you're in the kind of area that has undocumented neighbors who might need protections coming down the line, or having to be able to rely on someone. So tenants unions can often be a kind of ground up way to get to build community in a neighborhood, while also being able to fend off predatory behavior by landlords, illegal rent hikes, in some cases, even evictions. Are you in a union? Can you be in a union? Are you in a workplace that doesn't have a union, but you could potentially build one with your colleagues? I very much support that. Just any sites wherein you can build collective solidarity in your daily life, I think is a good first step. In terms of supporting the kind of groups that have been doing this kind of work, understanding, if we talk about reproductive freedoms, reproductive justice, obviously, even before the fall of Roe, there were millions of people that couldn't get access to abortion. So abortion funds, people who have aided people in getting abortion pills or abortion access in states with more readily available care and non-banned states, those groups through abortion fund networks have long existed, and they need support. Planned Parenthood does not need money. Planned Parenthood has been closing down clinics as soon as and closing down services as soon as there's even the gesture towards something becoming slightly illegal. They take no risks and they fund money into the Democratic Party machine. You do not need to give money to Planned Parenthood. Go online and look up local abortion funds in your city. These are the places that got a lot of money in 2016, and also after the fall of Roe, and then that money got there was a huge melt in so far as those donations. There are people who are committed to DIY production that is incredibly scientifically assured and safe of hormones for transition care that they circulate, and like those kind of networks of DIY mutual aid healthcare around trans people who are certainly imperiled, but have already been imperiled. Like, think of the attacks and passing of laws at the state level that the Democrats did nothing to intervene on. This idea that like Democrats lost because of caring about trans people. I would love to see Democrats care about trans people. Like, I await, um, but yeah, because we haven't seen it. But there are, so thinking about in your local areas, where are people in need of like support around, yes, gender affirming healthcare? Are there bills being passed in your school boards, or are there efforts being pushed in your school boards if you have kids that you can intervene in that make gender nonconforming and trans kids and LGBTQ kids less safe? Get involved on that level. And then mutual aid networks. Every city, every town. I'm not sure every town, but I'm pretty sure every city has forms of mutual aid networks. And obviously, we don't defeat a kind of instanti, like top down hierarchy of fascist power by mutual aid networks, but you certainly need them, as we saw in the pandemic. Even if they are band-aids, they're also ways of getting to know people and understanding where vulnerabilities are most stark and where struggle is most stark in your given area. I would also say, there's cop cities. Every city is a cop city because there's too many cops, in that there are cops. But I think the very nimble and, tactically savvy, if not on the back foot, Stop Cop City movement in Atlanta, I think, set an extraordinary example of the kind of work that should be done when when there's greater construction of these sort of counterinsurgency cop training facilities. And I think thinking of ways to plug in on those levels is crucial. I mean, I presume people listening to this podcast are into that kind of thing. But yeah, I do think tenants organizing and joining unions is, it's one of those things that's everyone lives in a house or a flat or a room, and everyone has to earn money. So ways in which you connect to the places you live and the people you work with, I think, is a good start. And not giving money to Planned Parenthood also.
Duly noted. I actually was trying to figure out how I could ask you a little bit about Cop City, and which is something I don't honestly think has gotten quite enough coverage based on the power of the fight against it and the power of the reaction to the fight against it, which is very um, disturbing. But I guess I lost my segue.
Cop City, not enough coverage. Powerful fight.
Okay, how about this? That bill that's currently in Congress that would give increased power to remove the nonprofit status
Mm-hmm.
of nonprofit news outlets and stuff. And the usual Democrat tepid response. All of that plus crackdowns on quote unquote environmental terrorism, all that. What I want to know really truly is, how should the left be talking about these things in the sense of free speech, especially in this world where the right is, crowing all day long about how they are the only ones that like free speech? I feel like there's some sort of communication barrier when it comes to talking about that. And I don't know how you would, talk about it in an abstract way, and also a sort of practical, this is what happens when you let X happen way.
Um, so I think, yeah, arguing on the terrain of free speech can sometimes be a bit of a red herring because, first of all, obviously, when it comes to the far right and people like Elon Musk, like pointing out their hypocrisy is pointing out hypocrisy in fascists is absurd because incoherence is very much like encompassed into that kind of thing. So there's no yeah, there's no kind of clearly no utility in pointing out that kind of hypocrisy. But nor is, I think, talking about free speech in the abstract particularly helpful unless you're quite literally like in a court of law and like calling upon your First Amendment rights, or needing to navigate some sort of like legalities or legal bureaucracies in that way. In movement politics, I think it's more important to talk about like what you're talking about. Like you want to be able to speak about, like, it's like I'm interested in free speech insofar as I want us to be able to speak out about Palestine. And it's interesting where speech is never free, and that is the Palestine exception. And obviously Palestinians being, 180 journalists slaughtered in Palestine in the last year. It's like no speech allowed. And so something like Cop City, where you're seeing really minor, a mixture of things. So obviously there's been extreme charges for all kinds of low level activities. Obviously there's been activity that would fall under criminal statutes regardless, right? Like property damage. No one is surprised if someone is charged for property damage. When they are charged as on state terror charges for property damage, that sort of malicious prosecution that is like almost certainly, and I mean, I'm touching wood here, almost certainly not going to stick as a conviction, like we saw with the J20 massive charges. So people that were facing, dozens of felonies for their protests at the Trump inauguration in 2017. Similarly, massively overcharging for minor violations at most. And usually those are just tactics to mass arrest to slow down a movement, right? And drain its resources and chill speech, chill activity. So that's what we've seen with the Atlanta charging, and there were over 60, I believe, people charged with RICO, so organized crime, conspiracy charges, racketeering, conspiracy charges. Some of those related to things like paying bail funds, normal like the most archetypal activist activity, paying for sign making materials, bringing resources for like, your most typical rally, most benign sort of archetypal nonviolent activity, facing RICO charges. A number of those have already been defeated, those charges, because they were, overreaching and groundless. But obviously they served a function in um sending a chilling effect and eating up resources, putting people out of action. And I think we'll see a lot more of that. And I think it's, all power to the comrades in Atlanta who've been pushing through and keep being active. And, they Cop City in Atlanta is being built, but that doesn't mean the struggle is over. If they build it, we, the abstract, we will burn it. And I think that has to be the attitude, right? It doesn't mean something's a loss just once one site of struggle. And it was also delayed for a long time, and it also did, I think, set an extraordinary example of diversity of tactics, actually. And I know that's like an overused phrase, but like it was really nice, really affirming after many years in movement politics of different types, when we've so often seen that kind of old canard of good protester, bad protester, like militants being thrown under the bus for doing for taking on more high risk or low level illegal activity, and then people saying, and then the more centrist liberal, like, no, non-violence only. We didn't see that so much in Atlanta, and I hope that example can be picked up. We saw mainstream, more kind of NGO looking and building a referendum around Cop City, focused activists, also, supporting, offering jail support, and refusing to condemn, and in fact supporting the militancy of those involved in, um, you know, uh, setting on fire some of the construction materials or police vehicles. And I think that's, crucial and too rare. And I want to see more of that. The best way to kill a movement is for people to start throwing each other under the bus, especially when what gets considered militant and extreme these days is, again, like property damage. Like that is and that we saw a lot of that building during, yeah, as you noted, the kind of Green Scare, when it really became very, very common for, um, yeah, vandalism of corporate property to be considered kind of grounds for terror charges. And I think we'll see more of that, and that's bad. That's bad. So we've got to
That's
stand together.
one of the most transparently, I don't know what I would call it, but just like the shamelessness of the use of that word is kind of why I don't like the word in general, because it's so very political and it says so much about violence. And, you know, the opposite of terrorism is the state doing something, which surely must be good because the state has, the justification and all. So,
Yeah, it's like who gets the monopoly on violence and force, and right, and in the same way, talking about, if I want to say that I think militancy in movements is a good thing, or is often a good thing, or at least we should be, refuse movements that reject the potentiality of militant tactics, or those who engage in them. um you know I sometimes feel like I've lost the plot. Like,
mhm.
when we were talking about, the student movements, student Gaza solidarity movements, and it was considered sort of militant when
I know.
Columbia students took over a building, and with the assistance of comrades, thank goodness, bringing people from outside the ivory tower in, the so-called outside agitators. All universities need outside agitators at all times. The inside outside of the university life in elite institutions is appalling in and of itself. And it was considered some next level extremism that people occupied a building at Columbia University, a building that's been occupied for anti-war movements for 70 years. This is And then the police stormed in a way that, as if in tactical gear, and the same at, City College, New York.
Mhm.
These police raids for the kind of activity that was honestly really quite kumbaya for the most part. So I think we've also got to be, on the kind of radical left, willing to reject this notion of what counts as extremism, what counts as militancy, what counts as radical action, when we're talking about like spray paint and
Yeah.
like a broken window. Same as, some comrades who have been, um, who are now currently in jail, for short sentences, thank goodness. The Merrimack Four, so activists who, engaged in, property damage, and entered into, banner dropped, or no, sorry, spray painted and released, colorful smoke, and chanted, and engaged in minor property damage at Elbit, Israeli weapons manufacturers.
Good
Um,
for them.
Fantastic for them. And they were at first facing like 3 decades in prison, which again was one of those overreaching prosecutorial, attempts. They've ended up with, I believe, 60 days in jail, these four young women, which, is still, I don't want to spend 60 days in jail, but it's certainly not 30 years. And they considered the beating of these felony charges to be a victory, and I agree with them. But this idea that their activity was something sort of beyond the pale and like deep militancy, it's like, this is a weapons manufacturer providing weapons to a genocide, and we're talking about some spray paint and some like colorful smoke. This is insane.
I would not want to, ponder how far something would be justified in that context. I know that is very justified. I mean that. Um, I think a lot of it comes down to people, at least speaking mostly about America, have no idea what, say, the civil rights movement looked like.
Mm,
If they know even a little bit, they might say, well, that Malcolm X fellow was a little radical, but I would have, been right there with Martin Luther King, because now he's mostly safe, though right wing people are trying to skewer that a little bit more. They don't. I mean, but at the time, most people thought he was a radical. As long as it's in the past, you can be on the right side of history. The
Yes,
trick is to catch
exactly.
it.
Yes, exactly. Liberals love being on the right side of history as long as it's comfortably in the past. But the yeah, and I think obviously yes, this is also partly it's a narrative problem, it's an educational
Mm-hmm.
problem. The Benjamin Walter Benjamin line of like even the dead are not safe. Because like obviously yes, like the dead radicals who
Mm-hmm.
um are either erased from history as being relevant actors or just are kind of taught as a distraction or
Mm-hmm.
a reason for the downfall of certain civil rights struggles, as opposed to these being completely co-constitutive movements. So I think there is a deep danger of whitewashing of um, Black Power history, of anti-colonial movements,
Mm-hmm.
and that doesn't mean that we have to repeat those histories. They had a huge amount of failures. Like I think, we can look at, and I think I'm thinking about it now because quite literally I just watched a TV show about it, but the Troubles in Ireland,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
and I think in the same way sometimes when we think people like to romanticize the IRA or romanticize the Red Army faction, the
Mm-hmm.
RAF in Germany. And I think there is something suddenly where, like, there's a reason that there is a romance to those movements and a romance to that type of urban guerrilla warfare. But obviously, like the sort of like perpetrated trauma of enacting, leaving pipe bombs and killing people. It's like I don't think any of that stuff should be romanticized.
Mm-hmm.
How things are considered acceptable or worthwhile or effective in historical narratives is a different question. But certainly it is. And so I don't think it's necessarily. I wouldn't take seriously a comrade who's like, let's do the IRA. I'm like, no, no, no. And also, there aren't enough. There aren't enough. There's the idea that an armed left makes sense to me sort of beggars belief given how outarmed we would be. I don't engage in like romance of civil war
Mm-hmm.
fantasy. I think it's silly. And I think it's unrealistic and I think it's dangerous and it's a little bit like an accelerationism, right? Like who are you
Mm-hmm.
winning?
Yeah.
Um but I would say certainly the fact that like that is what used to be considered a militant and now red paint is what is considered a militant,
Yeah.
I think should at least make us realize that like yes, the narrative power is within the state's narrative power has been extremely successful in foreclosing radical action, even the kind of radical action that has as its victim a corporate building which should not be given that status at all.
Um, we've talked a lot about sort of things within the left and talking to the left, but I always want to sort of ask more. But what about the normies? Like, where do you begin to speak to them and to reach out to people who think all college students are silly and maybe needed more discipline as children? Like, I don't know, just people who probably have some of the right empathy and the right ideas buried underneath a whole bunch of, well, you're trying to mess everything up, and that sounds scary, and sort of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm like I it's also there's so many different types of like what could count as a normie, right? So because there's no like one, there's the there's the kind of like paranoid white woman,
Yes.
middle upper middle class white woman who is kind of engaged in that same like I want to reproduce myself and my country and whiteness and that kind of pronatalist, and I'm like, is that a normie or is that a fascist? It's like and right. So
That's a fair
and then
question.
there's um and then there's obviously like the kind of liberal New York Times, presumed New York Times reader. um and I think obviously we don't want to fall into the trap that in fact the New York Times falls into and that the Democrats fall into, which is imagining the normie.
Mm-hmm.
It's always like this. I think one of my friends who's like used to work at the Times was like told by an editor once that it's something like a white Minnesota dentist is who they am. And I'm like, you're the very
Perhaps.
hardly representative of the United States of America, but okay, a white Minnesota dentist. And I think when you start chasing that kind of person that you've imagined, you end up talking to Liz Cheney. You know what I mean? It's like, I
Mm.
think, and like maybe a better way around it is to kind of sharpen our arguments together internally and meet people who are also like trying to make things better for communities around them. It's like there are a lot of people doing there are so many people kind of doing important work, right? Like working in healthcare, working in education, working in who don't necessarily need like convincing, but just need like community. And I don't know how to like offer that necessarily, but like I think this idea of obviously like a lot of the kind of buzzwords over the last years have been like polarization and silos, and I'm not saying those aren't true. Of course they speak to something. They're not meaningless characterizations, but there's also actually like a lot of consensus that like political formations that we have don't serve. Like people do want healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, people actually want the fucking genocide to end.
That's good.
People I think if people actually understood the ways in which no, it is not immigrants taking your jobs, and if it is in fact immigrants taking your jobs, it's because those in power are trying to segment the working class to accrue more value for capitalists, and that doesn't need to be the way. So I think trying to actually like sharpen the like be better at demystifying right-wing narratives, I think is an important job in the communities that we already are in. And then being willing to have those conversations with people, and it not just necessarily being about like you're not going to convince everyone, but understanding that you will convince more people than you might know, um and that you can sort of build by offering people things, by offering the ability to work together, by offering people, because that's things like I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to convince a right wing. I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to convince like a honestly, like a white Minnesotan Republican voter, when there are like hundreds of thousands of people who are like directly vulnerable to
Mm-hmm.
the desires of domination of perhaps a racist white Republican dentist. So I think building community with people who are keen for that already is actually kind of more of a priority to me than being like, how do I convince a Republican?
Yeah. And that
But
that fabled dentist, my understanding is they would be closer to upper middle class. They're probably pretty dentists make money. Like I think that dentist is probably doing all right and doesn't need to be reached out to as quite as much as
right, and I think people like you see amazing work done by like Amazon union workers, right?
mhm.
Because that is, you do get a real mix of political tendencies. And people from very different like countries, like state backgrounds, um, but all people in need, precariously employed people, or people that rely on, you know, very punishing jobs for a very powerful corporation. And those sort of sites of organizing give me a lot of hope. Like I'm not like salting an Amazon warehouse. I'm like, I don't
Mhm.
need to. There are already workers doing it. Um, but yeah, I don't know. So like I think it depends what one's role and job is. Like I teach and I write and I um organize, but usually, I'm not like going into like some sort of like heartland communities where Trump signs are abundant. Like usually if it's like a mutual aid group I'm working with, it's like bringing resources to unhoused people and migrants in New York who are not trying to vote for Trump. And if they are, like, that's a conversation that can be had about like why Trump's saying he'll bring the economy back would not actually like serve these people at all.
Well, the old chestnut of, if you come with me, you can step on the one other group and have a little more security. I mean, it works flawlessly. It's
Right. And it's like you like yeah, like can't you I will offer you the wages of whiteness. You know, it's like you can be inducted into this whiteness. And it's yeah, it's I mean it's those kind of like domination desires are like or like micro-fascisms are like, you know, they're latent. Anyone like they're not no one is like free of them.
mhm,
Um that doesn't I mean obviously people are more structurally um able to take advantage and foster them. So if you're like yes like if you are inducted into whiteness, if you possess whiteness already, um wanting to kind of maintain that white standing and appeals to that maintenance have been very powerful. um what Cedric Robinson called the re-whitening of America. We've seen it so many times. It's kind of like backlash around white standing,
mhm.
um that can even appeal to people not yet inducted into the wages of whiteness.
Yeah, and because there is a threat. I mean, there's a real threat behind the categories, even if they're not aware of the category of whiteness and stuff. The simple threat of deportation or no job or something. It's just an easy button that the state will forever be pushing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I guess to start wrapping up, I guess I want to ask you a little bit about the kids today in terms of your teaching and the Gaza encampments and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I was annoyed by anybody who wasn't kind of moved by that. I was very confused by, to say nothing of the people in Gaza who would, write a little message of thanks back and stuff. That just like that killed me. And I feel like the kids are more often than not on the right side of history, if we want to use that cliche. But like, I don't know, how are the kids doing? Are they
Kids these days. Well,
changing,
I'm in.
etc.?
I mean, it's really hard to know, right? Because I'm in New York City, and I teach at the new school in the
Mm-hmm.
graduate school, which yeah, no reason readers would know, but it's a historically like social justice, critical theory university. You know, it was in the 30s, university in exile for scholars, Jewish scholars in exile from the Nazis. It was founded about 20 years before that by former Columbia professors who refused to sort of sign a pro-war uh, oath, refused to sign a loyalty oath during World War One. So it's
Mm-hmm.
had a kind of anti-war and often, but not entirely, left-wing, but certainly like alleged social justice legacy, on which it has failed often as an
Mm-hmm.
institution. But it does mean that a lot of the students that come have that legacy in mind and want to uphold it, and that's great luck for me as a professor. But I was also up at Columbia quite a lot because I'm part of a group called Writers Against the War on Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out to Wawog. And we tried to help participate with some media training
Mm-hmm.
for the students in the encampments, because the media, from the obviously very cruel New York Post, but including, the New York Times, was so keen on this completely mendacious framing that these were anti-Semitic protests, that was so dangerous in so many ways. Obviously, the conflation of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, the fact that these were anti-genocide protests, anti-war protests, the biggest anti-war student movement since the Vietnam War. These were protests on universities in the knowledge that every university in Gaza had been like reduced to rubble. Like all this was like front in the mind of these students who were leading the way here, many of whom also were Jewish. So many of them, especially in New York. I had many, many Jewish students, and the erasure of these Jewish students by both the press, Congress, and even administrators who'd be like, we've got to understand that Jewish students are uncomfortable. It's like, well, I'm sorry, the Jewish students in my university who are in the encampment are as valid as the Jewish students who are not in the encampment. So like stop erasing, and
Mm-hmm.
Jewish professors like me, and like, the Jewish the student rabbi was at the new school, an amazing woman, was didn't have her contract renewed because she was part of the encampments, and it was the whole. So we saw this everywhere, and it was really disgraceful and serves a really really dangerous right wing narrative, and completely credulous to these kind of Republican Zionists
Mm-hmm.
pushing in Congress. We saw these appalling, um, witch hunts essentially. Always driven by Republicans who care not to scratch for Jews, it goes without saying.
Mm-hmm.
But the kids involved in these encampments that I saw were thoughtful, well organized, disciplined, desperate to do whatever they could. They weren't naive. They didn't think, certainly not the new school, but even if every university in the country divested, they knew that that would only be like a drop in the bucket. That's not going to end the genocide. But just using the space they could, and taking the platforms they could to do whatever they could do against complicity, and to share. And these were extraordinary sites of learning, as these kind of encampment spaces so often are. Teach-ins, bringing professors from different parts of the country and different parts of the city in these usually very siloed, disaggregated universities, some private, some public, this moments of connectivity and commitment to learning, which are being framed as a distraction from learning. It's
Mm-hmm.
extraordinary. The repression has been extreme, and including, as we mentioned, bringing in the armed police for some of the most kind of archetypal peaceful protest sort of activity. And I think it's very difficult to be part of a movement that feels crucial, enlivening, undeniably righteous, and to just see it be so repressed and so disavowed, even by a political center. But I don't see these kids then throwing it in and giving up. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
not what I'm seeing, and nor are their professors. And so I remain kind of in awe. I actually also, he wasn't here during the whilst, because the new school encampment was, it ended at the end of last semester, and now we don't have an ongoing. So the camping moment is sort of, I would say, over in the movement for now, at least, and like other tactics and ways of connecting are being and acting are being considered. But I have a student directly from Gaza
Mm-hmm.
who left Gaza in January. His home was bombed on October the 9th. So that's how quickly this all happened last year. His mother was killed. His sister was killed. He was gravely injured. 4 months later, got across to Egypt to have surgery on his arm. So he was able to get out. And he's on scholarship at the new school now. And he's just an extraordinary guy. So Ahmad Wahoudi, he also is a writer, who's been writing at the Intercept as well about his experiences. So what I mean, hearing from him directly as a 23-year-old who has lost his mother, his sister, his surviving family are in camps, in tents that are under constant threat of bombardment. It's like a teaching experience I've never had in my life. It's not like teaching. It's like just I'm obviously, we're all learning,
Mm-hmm.
but it's extraordinary, and the way in which um all my other students are so supportive, but also not patronizing, but also not kind of dehumanizing in their awe, has been really amazing. So I think the kids I am in touch with are more than all right. They're amazing. But I don't want to say that all, that like, like, thank goodness for the next generation or the next, because obviously, we did see a lot of particularly white young men become more radicalized towards the right. And that needs to be fought and addressed. And certainly it won't happen through centrist Democrats running as Republicans.
Probably not.
But no, I think it's been like really extraordinary to be connected to and write about and be within like the largest student movement in a generation.
That does sound pretty good.
Mm.
Okay, so all the way back to I'm gonna make you do a little very short lightning round thing, but
Yeah.
I also, if you want to talk about your book and your future book a little bit, if you want to
Yeah, so my future book I'm really behind on. So my existing book is a collection of essays that was first pulled together in 2019 and then was updated uh, in the post 2020 era with some more essays in
Mhm.
2021. And it's called Being Numerous Essays on Non-Fascist Life. And it's quite like an aleatory mixture of reported work, more kind of theory driven philosophical essays, and when it's about anti-fascism but in a very capacious way. So like it's not histories of fascism and what is or is not fascism. Like there's one essay about the kind of moral potentials of believing and disbelieving in ghosts at the same time. So
Hmm.
and
I'm intrigued already.
yeah, it's
Okay.
kind of, it gets a bit weird, but there's also aspects about the 2020 uprisings,
Hmm.
Standing Rock. There's yeah, the kind of limitations of like sex sexual activity and partnerships as like the forefront of political activity, whilst maintaining um the recognition that we can never remove that terrain from the train of politics, um which is also just me talking about a very very troubled and violent ex-partner of mine. So it's a little bit personal
Hmm.
at times, a little bit about the ambivalences of suicide.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's like quite an odd collection, but I often like advertise it as like you can keep it by the loo, because if you're spending a few minutes by the loo, just the essays aren't that long. The next book is probably going to be called On Uncertainty, slash certainty. My favorite philosopher, which is a bit old fashioned of me, is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is a uh, very dead, almost certainly was gay, British Austrian philosopher. And he is famous for a number of interventions. But my favorite intervention that he ever made really was the insistence that the meaning of a word is its use in the language. And I think actually that has a lot of political uses beyond what Wittgenstein put them to. And I'm not the first to suggest that, but it is what I like to work with a lot. And his final collected notes that were put together after his death, like much of his work was called On Certainty, and it was
Hmm.
about drawing the distinction between what it is to act with knowledge and what it is to act with certainty. And it would take a little bit too long to go into that now, but I think his distinction there is a useful one for our times, given that we are bombarded constantly with the messaging of in these uncertain times. Like, you'll get that email from like your boss, like your from Netflix, from like your insurance, from like Amazon Prime, and I'm like, oh yeah, in these uncertain times. And of course, like we get that messaging because it resonates, right? Like
Hmm.
there is a lot about which we don't know, but there are also a lot of organizing entrenched certainties that have very little to do with shared collective knowledge, but actually entrenched practices and inculcated practices and ideologies that would, the sort of things that Wittgenstein would, I believe, categorize as certainties that we should be attending to, and maybe shifting towards better certainties. So rather than just pointing blindly at uncertainty, and thinking that the taming of probability will serve, I think it's actually a good time to be attending to some of the inculcated certainties of contemporary living, be they border logics,
Hmm.
gendered binarism, white supremacy, um, and yes, even our very notion of what constitutes crisis. I think needs a little bit of poking apart, and so it will be a not very long book because um, I just don't think I could, because I think it will be a short book. But I keep taking too long to write it because there's so much to report on these days, and teaching, and the news keeps getting in the way. It's a
Hmm.
problem with having too many jobs. But hopefully it will come out in 2026.
Okay.
So
All right. Let's see if we can do a little lightning round situation. Uh, Optimism or pessimism?
Optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect.
Hmm.
Scrumptious.
Oh, okay. Um, what is the first band you ever saw, or the best? Actually, the best concert. Either
Ooh, that's such a good question. I yeah. Oh God, I don't, you know what? I know he's a bit shit now because he has like said nice things about Israelis, but Israel as a country. But I saw Nick Cave in
one.
a woods in Berlin, in like a wood dark face, like with like lights, and it was in like this like beautiful stage in the middle of a wooded part of Berlin because my husband's from Berlin,
That sounds
and we
really
went
good.
with my husband. We went with my husband's dad, and it was really magical. But it was actually the most extraordinarily beautiful concert that I've ever been to. So
that that's an
yeah,
excellent answer. Worst either U.S. president and or British prime minister. Just
Margaret Thatcher, um, probably I don't know Andrew Jackson
mm, okay,
and
fair.
Trump and Jackson, very similar.
Um, oh gosh, I didn't write down. First historical stop if you got a time machine.
Oh, good question. It's like because the thing is, I would say like the Paris Commune, but I'd be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's so difficult and dirty, and I'm a princess. No, but yeah, probably the Paris Commune. You'd want to try it. You'd want to see.
It would be hard to pick, I think. And I always thought like I'd stop at like see the Clash first, and then maybe find my
Then
way to something a little
Clash,
more.
then Paris Commune.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, 70s London does sound quite fun as well, you know.
Yeah, when you were mentioning squatters' rights stuff, all I could think of was my greatest association with this is just Joe Strummer, like
Mm.
ranting in the 1977. But that's just me. Um, um, how would I get a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia?
Oh, that's a good question. No, we can have restaurants in my utopia.
That's good.
Yeah, do you remember that? Like, yeah, Twitter debate. It was like, will there be restaurants under communism? It's like, yeah, like we can have restaurants. You'll have so it'll be like a nice, locally sourced, and maybe you won't be able to get one all year round. Depends
Okay.
on. Do you know what I mean? It's like I don't
Hmm.
actually know how coffee is coffee. I don't. I'm not agriculturally aware enough to know about coffee bean growth. But if it is not sustainable for people to have cappuccino coffee all year round, then we shall not. But you shall. But when you will be able to have one, you shall have a lovely one at a restaurant with someone who has all their needs met.
Okay. That sounds all right. We can work with that. Do you have, let's say, three book, doc, movie, whatever media recommendations that kind of speaks to you as a person that might get someone to understand you without being by you? Do you
Oh
have?
yeah, that's a good question. So I do actually recommend that people read Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Um, it's one of those books that you really don't have to read it all the way through. Like you can pick up trains of thought and follow him through them because he really like takes you through his thinking. It's like he's holding your hand through the page, and even if it gets a bit lost, he can get a bit lost too. And it's, but I think it's extraordinary. And I wish I could think. I mean, who doesn't? But I really wish I could think like that.
Mhm.
But like, yeah, this question of like breaking down how we actually think and talk about the world and what that does for our activities, the activity of meaning making. He's really my guide for that.
Mhm.
Um, Another thinker I wish I was more like, but because I'm actually a really non-utopian thinker, like my brain just doesn't do that very well. I'm like more analytic, and I'm jealous of utopian thinkers. But I also just want to give her a shout out, which is Sophie Lewis, who is the author of Full Surrogacy Now, also the author of Abolish the Family.
Mm.
And she has a book coming out next year called Enemy Feminisms, about all the kind of the legacies of kind of fascist, transphobic, liberal, border Zionist feminisms, and why we shouldn't say no, those aren't feminists, or call them so-called feminists. We actually have to reckon with the problematic parts of our histories, our movement histories, our leftist, feminist, anti-fascist histories. So that and she's just a genius. And another piece of media that I just recommend. I'm actually going to do two. Lux magazine is just a delight, and I think
Okay.
especially if you have, um, you know, it's one of those like true all ages. Like it's brilliant writing for anyone to read. It's a glossy magazine, Marxist feminist magazine with an internationalist lens. But it's also a great one for like people just coming into their political awarenesses because, magazine format, um, meant to read as digestible and appealing. And then a kind of slightly another great publication that's new that I mentioned before earlier is Parapraxis magazine, because I think I actually think it's really important that we include psychoanalytic thinking in our leftist critiques and theorizing, as well as economic thinking, as well as Marxism. Like I think a Marxism without a psychoanalytic tending we'll miss a lot, and we have missed a lot, especially when it comes to questions of like grief and drives and libidinal desires, and that's not to say you can like reduce things to a Freudian analysis anymore either. Of course you can't, but I think this magazine does an extremely good job of taking seriously materialist analyses, and then also not foreclosing a kind of more psychoanalytic way of thinking. And I think we kind of need that right now. So Parapraxis magazine is my other.
That is an intriguing collection of things, definitely. I'm
Mm.
always glad to know about magazines that I'm not aware of, too, because that are still out there.
Yeah, and these are new. Lux and Parapraxis are new, so
That's good. Oh my
you're
gosh.
also
Okay, let's I should let you go back into the world to do what you must do. But
thank you. This was very nice.
I'm very happy. I love that you came on. I thank you so much. And where can the people of the internet find you?
So they can find my kind of newsy columns and stuff at the Intercept. I am on X Twitter, just Natasha Lennard, NatashaLennard. I'm also on Bluesky, which everyone is doing now.
Mm-hmm.
Same name. If you just search me on Bluesky, I'll come up. I don't really know how the like handles work there, but I'm on both X and Bluesky, and I probably won't leave Twitter for a while because I hate myself. Hate myself. No, but yes, so there. And I will post work in both places.
All right, that sounds good. I don't know, as usual, you can find Non-Serviam all over the internet, including on Bluesky. Still on Twitter, that was. I'm trying to get off that terrible hellscape. Mastodon. Find me on there. Usually it's Lucy Stag, and find Non-Serviam, and definitely find Natasha. So thank you again. You're listening to the Non-Serviam podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. And you can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.